Good evening. This is Mae Brussell in Carmel, California. It's tape 452, August the 3rd, 1980, side 1. We've had some mechanical difficulties at KLRB in taking the tape directly off the air. We've tried to put the attachment into the tape cassette so that the tapes going out to you will be the ones that I do have on KLRB each week. But there were some mechanical problems this evening, as there were last week. So I came home from doing the hour at KLRB, and I'm going to make the cassette for you at this time. There are some advantages and disadvantages to sending these tapes out on the air. When I went off the air and started the newsletter by subscription on the cassettes, it was a much more personal affair, and I felt that the news rolled along faster and that I could get right into material quicker and speed it along. And some of you are very sharp, and you send me articles and books and material and understand completely what I'm saying. After being off of KLRB specifically for 2 years, there's quite a culture lag, and it's very hard to bring the people up to date. I feel like I'm almost talking down to the audience that's been taking the tapes continuously, trying to catch them up with terms and names that we use. It's going pretty well in terms of the local community accepting the material again. It's really great. So that you subscribers on the tape will have to bear with me as I repeat some material that you've had. I'm trying not to repeat information you've had while I'm giving them new information and filling the pieces. So there is that problem. Just bear with me a few weeks, and hopefully next week the cassette again will go back from what they get on the air here in KLRB. This is an election year, and I get many letters and calls about my opinion on the various candidates, whether it's Ronald Reagan or Jimmy Carter or whoever is going to be nominated in the Democratic Convention, which will be taking place shortly. I'll do maybe 1 hour in August on the best and the worst of Reagan, and also I'd like to do an hour tape, if possible, on the decline of Jimmy Carter. I started a file on Jimmy Carter January 1979 called Carter Going Down, similar to the way Richard Nixon was pulled out of office. The disarray of the Democratic Party is well orchestrated, not that they didn't fall for all of the tricks and contribute to their own decline by being surrounded with people who were going to bring the Carters down, introducing Rosalind Carter to these various people like John Gacy or Jim Jones and the Ippolito brothers and organized crime figures, and sending Billy Carter to Libya to meet with Gaddafi. I mentioned last week he isn't a world leader, and Robert Vesco met with 2 members of Congress in the Bahamas last week, and they were going down that Sunday, just the time I was doing the broadcast, and I said Billy Carter isn't an international figure. He isn't a wheeler dealer. He's never really gotten into this kind of thing. And the Carters are being set up. And then Monday's newspaper, just this Monday the 28th of July, Robert Vesco said, I was just being used to bring down Billy Carter. When the congressman from Arizona and Utah, Orrin Hatch, went down to see Billy Carter's great pal, Robert Vesco. Vesco explained to them that he was doing this to embarrass the Carters, and the congressman came back and said, well, you can't believe what Vesco says. He's so slimy, that creepy little guy. In just about that many words, they shut up. But if Robert Vesco had given them a lot of dirt about Billy Carter, then he would have been brilliant and intelligent and very reliable. So that this last week they were quiet on the Carter affair, fairly quiet, but Billy and Jimmy Carter were swept more into the Libyan Gaddafi scandal, which surrounds Jimmy Carter at this time. So in the next few weeks I'll do a couple of hours, in the next few months, a couple of hours on the political demise of the Carter family. Gerald Ford spoke at the Republican convention, and he was one of the primary speakers, and there was a paragraph in his speech. I don't know how many of you heard him or read it. It was reprinted in the New York Times, but there is this statement by Gerald Ford in quotes, "We are a peaceful nation because we are free. happy, and united people in a system that works, unlike the Soviet Union, which uses force to keep a death grip on its people. Ford continued, just look around the world at other nations. Assassins who get there by force. Despots who come to power by fear, not by free elections. Our leaders come from our people, a continuous constitutional line of men and women from the people, from places like Grand Rapids, Michigan, Plains, Georgia, and soon from Eureka, Illinois. Gerald Ford was on the Warren Commission. He was a person that hid the conspiracy to murder the President of the United States, who was chosen by an election by the people. He didn't say, he didn't refer to New York City, where Nelson Rockefeller was killed, or Los Angeles, where Robert Kennedy was killed, or Dallas, Texas, John Kennedy. And he didn't talk about presidents coming from the people, such as from Whittier, California, climbing on the corpses of various persons in order to gain and obtain that White House prestige and power. He didn't refer to the murdered Chappaquiddick of the White House plumbers. Mary Jo Kopechne was murdered in order to keep Ted Kennedy from running for president in 1972, or the shootout in Laurel, Maryland, when the White House plumbers and the White House officials were begging George Wallace not to run and split the votes with him. They took him up in an airplane and had a long talk with him. And the eve of his primary in Michigan and Maryland, he was shot and crippled, and those conservative votes helped Richard Nixon's election. Gerald Ford worked with Nazis, not neo-Nazis, with fascists. He worked with the intelligence community, the CIA, Navy intelligence, and he, of all people, should know that we do not have a continuous constitutional line of men and women from the people. The people have nothing to say about this. The candidates are selected by bullets and blackmail, and Gerald Ford should know that very well. I got an article from the New York Post from one of the subscribers to these tapes who listens and sends some fantastic articles, and it's a quotation of G. Robert Blakey. He was head of the House Select Committee on Assassinations. He is servicing a little more. I criticized him a few weeks ago for traveling around with Anthony Summers, who wrote Conspiracy, and Blakey continuously cutting off the investigation of John Kennedy and Martin Luther King beyond whispering that was probably organized crime. But Blakey was quoted in the New York Post this last week. Blakey, in quotes, was critical of the Department of Justice, saying it deliberately delayed acoustic tests of tape recordings of the Kennedy shooting. I've talked with people in the Department of Justice, and they are postponing the acoustics as long as possible because they know how it is going to come out. There were two shooters. Blakey said the department is afraid to admit it was wrong in its determination in 1964 that only one assassin was involved. The House Select Committee on Assassinations has, in Volume 12, a list of a possible 24 suspected firing points in Dealey Plaza. If there was more than one gunman, and there were two or more, there's a suggestion of where they could have come from. The easternmost sixth-floor window, called the famous Oswald window, the roof of the Texas School Book Depository, the seventh floor of the depository, the fourth floor, the innermost window, the westernmost pair of sixth-floor windows, the other side from where Lee Harvey Oswald was, the roof, the Dow Tex building, the second floor, the third floor, the upper floor of the Dow Tex roof, the county records building, the county records second floor, the stockade fence on top of the grassy knoll, the cement retaining wall in front of the stockade fence, in front of the cement structure on the knoll, the railroad overpass, a storm drain at the north curve of Elm Street, the umbrella man with a weapon described in Senator Church's committee. The CIA described a weapon, fatal weapon, gun concealed in an umbrella, and the south knoll, the grassy knoll on the south side of the plaza on Commerce Street. As I say, Volume 12, page 306 and 7 goes into the possibilities of where these shots came from based upon the positions of John Connally and John Kennedy and photographic evidence that was procured from various people in the Dealey Plaza area. Many were not called before the Warren Commission. The reason I go into Blakey's statement about more than one gunman and the positions where they could have fired from the grassy knoll is that the way this is accomplished is weapons with silencers. And silencers are made for the State Department and for the Central Intelligence Agency by Mitchell Werbel, who works with these assassination teams and whose name surfaced recently in the news with the arrest of Frank Terpil, or Francis Terpil, and George Korkola and Ed Wilson. The biggest story in the country I mentioned last week when I went back on KLRB was and is the arrest of Terpil and Korkola. We've done many tapes, and you subscribers have the advantage of 5 or 6 or 7 tape cassettes on these characters. And when I'm talking on KLRB, it's hard to update them with this information because they don't have the back facts, and I don't like to repeat what you already have. The reason I feel it was so big is that the scandal of Billy Carter being in Libya and possibly selling a couple of airplanes to Gaddafi is nothing compared to the Central Intelligence Agency through Terpil and Korkola and Samuel Cummings in London of selling at least $2 million of weapons to the PLO, to another $2 million to Idi Amin, another $2 million to Gaddafi. This team of persons that are being exposed in a network that will be more prominent in the court trials to come up concerning their arrests. These people have funded the athletes, the killing of the Jewish athletes at the Munich Olympic Games, the FALN, the Alpha 66, the anti-Castro Cubans. Just as I wrote, the SLA is the CIA. The terrorism that looked to be left has always been funded by the CIA, and this group are in the news now and will be in the news more as Billy Carter gets attached to the Libyan connections and Gaddafi. You'll hear more about Terpil and Korkola. As a matter of fact, in this Sunday's paper today in the Chicago Tribune is a picture of Billy Carter playing golf and an article by James Coates. As I say, it's from the Chicago Tribune. Congressional investigators have received Justice Department files suggesting that Billy Carter, the president of the brother of the president, Jimmy Carter, was involved in a scheme to obtain machine guns for pro-terrorist Libyan government. The most bizarre side issue as yet to come out of this whole case centers, according to the Chicago Tribune, on Francis Terpil, a former CIA agent and soldier of fortune who allegedly has run a global hit squad for Libya. The important thing about Terpil and Korkola is that they're not former CIA agents, and Ed Wilson is not a former CIA agent. When men are arrested or caught, they become former. E. Howard Hunt and James McCord were part of the CIA. When they were arrested at Watergate or discovered at Watergate, they were described as being former agents. McCord Associates was a dummy front, still for the CIA. E. Howard Hunt got his photographs, his clothing, his safe houses for burglarizing a psychiatrist's office in Beverly Hills from the CIA. These men got all of their agents, their plumbers, Frank Sturgis, Bernard Barker, Mr. Martinez. They all came from the CIA. The team were CIA operatives, but when they were arrested, they were described as former. There were 2 articles that I did describe last May on tape 442, May 23rd, from the New Jersey Courier Post about Robert Vesco saying the FBI planned to kill me, and the FBI had a kidnap plot called Operation Kingfish, in which they were going to drug and kidnap Vesco because of his links to Jimmy Carter and his $10 million payoff or offer to the Carter administration in exchange for his not being brought to this country to stand trial. In spite of the fact that he could be very angry about the attempt to assassinate him, drug him, and kidnap him, he still had the guts enough to come out, as I say last week, and say that he was used to set up Billy Carter. But this latest story about Billy Carter being in Libya with Frank Terpil, gets the case even more complicated, and according to the Chicago Tribune, this story just started to surface last April. That isn't true. The Terpil, Korkola, Wilson story started to surface the first of this year, and the news media has had this deadly silence until they could bring in Billy Carter and Libyan connections. But it's interesting, the Justice Department has said, and a judge in Washington, D.C. have agreed that they're not going to do the trial against these men, Wilson and Terpil, until November the 5th, the day after the presidential election. They said Terpil is free on $100,000 bond. A Washington federal judge, because of publicity surrounding the president's brother, set a trial for November the 5th for Terpil and Wilson. Now, they're being charged for a list of crimes. One is being a conspiracy to murder a Libyan defector who went to Egypt. The other was for transporting explosives abroad and acting also as unregistered agents. So a murder trial of a Libyan is being postponed in Washington, D.C. because of the publicity of Billy Carter. So I'm sure that at the time of the trial, Billy Carter may come out if his brother isn't nominated and tell more about this assassination team and cinch their murder trial also. So they're going to wait and see who's nominated for President of the United States, and then the trial is put off until after the presidential elections, which is pretty cute. The name Wilson, Ed Wilson, is interesting because Bob Woodward of the Washington Post, who did so many stories on Watergate, picked up his name as being part of the team that killed Letelier and Sandra Moffat in Washington, D.C. Also, the Chicago Tribune story on Billy Carter and the Libya gun connection with Frank Terpil leads out the important part of George Korkola, who has the New Jersey assassination teams, who trains assassins for all over the world. New Jersey, the home of I.G. Farben, of organized crime and the casino mob, of a lot of the Alpha 66, the most violent anti-Castro Cubans are in New Jersey. There were links of Jonestown to New Jersey, and the New Jersey connections are very important to the Washington, D.C. Samuel Cummings weapons procurer in London. And the story in the news of Billy Carter so far only rubs to Terpil and not to Korkola with the assassination teams. But the Washington Post picked up that they call him former CIA agent Edwin Wilson was suspected of having provided the detonator of the Letelier Moffat bomb, and information has come through the Justice Department and investigations that this Ed Wilson, who was active and worked with the anti-Castro Cubans and the New Jersey assassination teams, and with Mitchell Warbell and that weapons systems outfit, this same person who's linked to all of this is also linked to Terpil in a court case of a murder and assassination in Washington, D.C. right now. Billy and Jimmy Carter have promised to tell all about the Libyan connections, but I'll bet you that national security will keep them from telling the whole truth. It's hard to fill in for the radio listeners all of the tapes we've done on conspiracies and the weapons systems from Zaharoff to Samuel Cummings in London and their links to Terpil and Korkola. In May of this year, 1980, on tape 441, I have mentioned a book called The Weapons Merchant by Bernd Engelman, and it's about Samuel Cummings of the CIA and his Philadelphia connections and links to London and Monte Carlo, described in this book as the largest private arms dealer in the world, who inherited the mantle of the sinister Sir Basil Zaharoff of Monte Carlo. I also have mentioned, going back to tape 435, April the 4th, the Philadelphia connections to assassinations and weapons, Tsarist terrorists, and going into the Monte Carlo connections, and again Samuel Cummings, and the Philadelphia connections of Cummings and the main line of Philadelphia to Grace, Princess Grace of Monaco, a czarist named Cummings Catherwood, the Fox Munitions Corporation, George DeMohrenschildt, Lee Harvey Oswald's closest friend, his Philadelphia connections, Ruth Payne, the woman that housed and kept Marina when She stayed with Lee while he went down to New Orleans to get housing. Frank Sturgis, the anti-Castro Cuban, Sylvia Odio. I did a tape on 20 Philadelphia connections to the John Kennedy assassination. Well, there was an item to follow this up, a fascinating item in the News Washington Post this last week by Maxine Cheshire, and she continuously puts out in her weekly columns bits of pieces of information that are little gems. And this last week she was describing the Republican convention and the social life and what Mrs. Reagan was wearing and what Elizabeth Taylor was wearing and Anna Chennault. Then she comes to a paragraph and she says, Senator John Tower's wife, sister of international arms merchant Sam Cummings, confirmed reports that her brother had recently been back in the United States. Cummings, a former CIA agent who now holds Irish citizenship and lives in Monaco while running his global Inter-Armco, was back in town for the first time in years, Mrs. Tower said, just about 2 months ago. Well, that was a nice little tidbit to pick up about Senator Tower's wife. Senator Tower is from Texas, and I went instantly to my Warren Commission hearings to get out the copy of the correspondence that Lee Harvey Oswald had with Senator Tower in San Antonio, Texas, and Washington, D.C. He wrote to him, rather, that he was ready to come home. He wrote to him from the Soviet Union, Dear Senator Tower, my name is Lee Harvey Oswald, and he tells that he's an American in Moscow and he wants to bring his Russian wife home. He wrote the letter to Tower in January of 1962. Oswald's letter was sent to the State Department, and the State Department replied to Senator Tower about the correspondence and that they would take care of it, and they suggested, the state advised Senator Tower not to become involved in this case, and they wrote him a letter. Tower sent his letter, copy of Oswald's letter to him, January 26, 1962, signed John Tower, and he said this inquiry should go to the executive branch. I don't know why it wouldn't go to the State Department. Lee Harvey Oswald, as I have said many times, was an agent of Navy intelligence. He was bringing home a white Russian czarist who was leaving the Soviet Union, who was brought up as a little princess, a spoiled brat, and he was transporting her to the United States under the guise of being his wife. They had a civil ceremony. And when he was ready to come home, he asked for his passport that was kept in the office of the American Embassy and money to come home and to bring her home. So he wrote to Senator Tower in January 1962. George DeMohrenschildt, the fellow I referred to many times, Oswald's close friend, intelligence agent, pro-Nazi, worked with Nazis, worked with the intelligence community ever since he left Poland and his family had fled Russia. His father ran the Baku oil fields for the Nobel family, later hopefully taken over the oil contracts by Rockefeller. DeMohrenschildt testified in Volume 9 of the Warren Commission hearings about Marina Oswald. He said, you know exactly the story of her life, that she comes from a family of ex-Tsarist officers. Her father had been a Tsarist officer of some kind. You see what I mean? I don't remember whether it was the Navy or the Army. I don't recall anymore. Her mother remarried, and he goes into the background. I don't remember what her father's profession was. Now, that was one of the deep, dark secrets of the Warren Commission, was the background of Marina Oswald, but I believe, because of the way the Russian community treated her in the Dallas-Fort Worth area, that she was related to one or more of those people there. Well, after Lee Harvey Oswald sent his letter to John Tower in January, then in March, the State Department pushed all waivers aside for Marina Oswald and sent a letter in view of the strong representation made by an appeal in the State Department of one member of the State Department of March 1962. You are hereby advised that sanctions imposed of Immigration and Nationality Act are hereby waived in behalf of Mrs. Oswald. He sent the letter to Senator Tower in January 1962. Tower sent it to the executive branch, and by March, all conditions for her were waived. They also wrote in the Warren Commission, volume 24, page 298, that there were sections there about a Russian person coming to the United States, a Section 212. Section 212 said that there had to be a file check on Marina Oswald by the CIA, the FBI, the Department Security Office, the Division of Biographical Intelligence, and the Passport Office. And all holds on Marina were taken off, and in quotes, the Warren Commission hearing said the procedure for handling eligibility is determined by the Attorney General, and it was relegated here that Marina Oswald should be allowed to come and that there would be a waiver of Sanction 243. At first, it was not authorized, according to the State Department documents. There was a refusal to pass a waiver on the Oswalds, but then they decided that they would pass it, that this was an extra special case, and they added that they should be on their way to the country as soon as possible. March 16th, the Soviet Affairs Office, that's the United States Embassy in the Soviet Union, of the State Department, advised the Visa Office that it is interest of the United States to get Lee Harvey Oswald and his family out of the Soviet Union and on their way to this country as soon as possible. Now, it seems that Senator Tower's name came in the news media immediately after the assassination of John Kennedy, and there's a comment here or an exhibit talking about the matter that concerns Lee Harvey Oswald after the assassination for the purpose of clearing wild charges made in the foreign and domestic press to the effect that Senator Tower facilitated Oswald's repatriation and coming back to the United States. So evidently, right after the assassination, there was information in the news media about Lee Harvey Oswald approaching Senator John Tower to get Marina and himself home. I think that the assassination of John Kennedy was set up as soon as Richard Nixon lost the election to John Kennedy. Robert Mayu had met with the assassination teams since the summer of 1960 and was setting up the potential to kill not only Fidel Castro, but to kill John Kennedy. John Rosselli and Carlos Marcello's organized crime were making their blending with the intelligence community and the assassination squads. And the cover for these assassinations, I'm sure if they were planned as early as 60-61, would be perfect to use a man like Lee Harvey Oswald bringing his czarist wife to the United States and her testifying and claiming Oswald was guilty, he was the lone nut, covering the real conspirators and the people behind the assassination. They were to be used to cover the crime of assassination, not for the shooting, but to given their set of personalities and the lies that were fabricated about them, it would be believable that Lee Harvey Oswald could have shot the president. I think the link of John Tower and his sister to Samuel Cummings, Mitchell Werbel, and the assassination teams in Washington, D.C. and in New Jersey is fascinating, and in Pennsylvania, that his wife is a person from the main line in Philadelphia whose brother handles these assassination weapons and sells them all over the world and kills heads of states all over the world and sets up coups and counter-revolutions and terrorism. The fact that the wife of Senator John Tower is the sister of Samuel Cummings is a point that has many, many implications, and I'm dwelling on this because those of you that have studied the assassination know what I mean. There's another sideline to the story of Tower, because I hadn't looked up this testimony. Maybe it's been 10 years since I went through every word of the Warren Commission hearing. So much has happened since I read and cross-filed that material that when I looked up the correspondence of Tower, I read that his secretary, the woman in the Senate office in charge of his affairs, is Miss Linda Lee Lovelady. Now that's a very unusual name, because there was a gentleman, Billy Nolan Lovelady, who was a dead ringer for Lee Harvey Oswald, who was standing at the doorway the day that John Kennedy was killed. His wife's name is Patricia Lovelady, but I don't know if he has a sister that worked for Senator Tower or not. Most of the witnesses, the 552 witnesses that talked before the Warren Commission and were called to testify, gave their name, their address, the name of their wife, and their siblings, and got into their background before they gave their testimony under oath, whatever it's worth. But Billy Lovelady is this controversial person that was suspected of being a double of Lee Harvey Oswald, and that name is so unusual that I wondered if the secretary working for John Tower in Washington, D.C. was related to the Lovelady who was at the Texas School Book Depository where Lee Harvey Oswald worked. On the other part of this tape, I'll do a little bit more about Lovelady before we go on to some of the other material. This is Mae Brussell in Carmel, California. It's tape number 452, August the 3rd, 1980. It's side 2 of the tape. I want to make a few apologies on this side of the tape before we go any further. We had some mechanical problems last week on KLRB. At the break of the tape, instead of breaking the end of the tape, go fast forward. There was some more space on the tape. I turned it over at the station while we took the break at the end of the 30 minutes and didn't run the first side over to the end. So we ran short at the other end because when I began the second half, there were a few minutes on the tape that weren't correct. The tape was the right length. It actually was much longer than 30 minutes on each side, and I hadn't put it to the end. So hopefully by next week we'll get some of those kinks out of the situation. And also, while I'm apologizing, I did something that I have never done on radio, or I don't think I have, and you can correct me if I'm wrong. I should be getting corrections from you, and I want to bring it up before we go back to John Tower and Billy Lovelady and possible connections to Oswald and the book depository. Just before I went on the air last week, somebody called and told me about Mr. Morgenthau passing away in New York City, and they were under the impression that the Morgenthau that passed away was the one who had prosecuted or arrested Terpil and Korkola December 22nd, 1979 in New York City that caused this arrest. And I put that on the air, and I very seldom, if ever, do a tape or a radio broadcast without the article or the source directly in front of me. I've received information such as the gemstone file from Bruce Roberts and other unpublished documents, the Torbett document, and so forth, years and years before I put one sentence of it on the air or have mentioned it at all. I've researched it out. And the information that I got on the call was in error. It was Hans Morgenthau who died. He's a political scientist and a former Defense Department consultant, worked at MIT, Yale, Princeton, Harvard, Columbia University, University of Chicago, and was active for the study of American foreign and military policy out of Chicago Center there. That was the Hans Morgenthau that died. It was not Robert Morgenthau, the U.S. Attorney in New York City. I put on the printed sheet Robert Morgenthau, and I even spelled it wrong on the printed sheet, a typographical error. I knew the spelling. But I didn't have the articles in front of me when somebody told me about this death, and it's not the same Morgenthau. But I do think that the position of arresting Terpil and Korkola and forcing Samuel Cummings to come to the United States and then linking Billy Carter to the worldwide assassination teams from the Central Intelligence Agency might turn out to be a little unhealthy for Robert Morgenthau as well. I think that's a little dangerous to arrest these people, but the other alternative is they get off anyway. Well, just briefly, I don't want to dwell on the point too long, but Billy Lovelady was a very controversial person. There's pictures of him in the House Select Committee hearings in the original Warren report, and the new investigation, this 1977-78 investigation of the assassination of John Kennedy, said, this is volume 12, page 292, due to the blurred quality of the enlargement of the spectator's image in the Algins photograph of Billy Nolan Lovelady standing in front of the Texas School Book Depository, it was not possible either to identify or to exclude positively that it was Lovelady or Oswald standing at the door. Based on a subjective assessment of the facial features of the spectator, it was determined that the man in the doorway bears a stronger resemblance to Lovelady than to Oswald. thus assuming it is either Oswald or Lovelady and not a third party. It appears highly improbable that the spectator is Oswald, and highly probable that he is Lovelady, so that at the time that John Kennedy was assassinated, there was a man sitting at the doorway, not sitting, standing at the doorway, who was photographed, who so closely resembled Lee Harvey Oswald that the new investigative committee couldn't determine to identify, to exclude the fact that it could be Oswald, but it probably was Lovelady. Well, they have pictures of the clothing that Lee Harvey Oswald wore when he was arrested and the clothing that Lovelady had, and it's very controversial, touchy subject whether or not Lee Harvey Oswald was in the book depository. He certainly wasn't on the 6th floor, and he says he was on the 2nd floor having a Coke. But only somebody close to the assassination teams could create a duplicate, a double, so much like Lee Harvey Oswald that years later they couldn't figure out which one it was. And of course, Billy Lovelady was never called to the House Select Committee investigating the assassination, nor to the Warren Commission. He died in seclusion. There was an article coming out of Dallas, Texas. He lived in Denver, Colorado, and in January 19th, 1978, he died in seclusion. The article says, Oswald look-alike, dies in seclusion. Billy Nolan Lovelady, 41, worked with Lee Harvey Oswald in the Texas School Book Depository. It was definitely Lovelady in the doorway, according to the Warren Commission, so with little supportive evidence that was ever offered. This led conspiracy theorists to assert it was Oswald in the window. Now that Lovelady died, according to his attorney in Colorado, he would not reveal specifically where Lovelady died, and he hoped that this would forestall any further inquiries. There was no reason to doubt that he died of natural causes. There's been constant pressure on him. He died at the age of 41, and according to his doctor, this is going to kick up a lot of conspiracies, a lot of theories, and his wife of 15 years said he is not going to be harassed anymore. He was under stress, according to the doctor and his wife. He had a lot of stress. He paid for it dearly. He was in the trucking business in Colorado, and as I say, there was no autopsy. They said natural causes were presumed. So Billy Lovelady died, like George DeMohrenschildt and other primary witnesses, when the House Select Committee was doing their investigation. He was never called by the Warren Commission. He was never allowed to appear before the House Select Committee years later. And the interesting thing is that unusual name and the fact that he didn't testify, and that a woman by the name of Lovelady worked for Senator John Tower, who was suspected of assisting Lee and Marina Oswald to come to this country, with Lovelady never testifying and with his quick demise at a time where he could be useful to solving the question of Oswald doubles. The secretary to John Tower with this unusual name, and now John Tower's wife is the sister of Samuel Cummings, the Philadelphia mainline link of the intelligence community to the assassination teams and the procurer of weapons. It certainly makes an interesting story to ponder about. There were other Texans involved in the assassination of John Kennedy, of course, besides the Philadelphia connections. Way back in 1979, tape 396, I talked about Fred Korth, former Secretary of the Navy from Fort Worth, Texas, and his role with General Dynamics, and with Edwin Ekdahl, the attorney for Edwin Ekdahl, Lee Harvey Oswald's stepfather. He was married to Marguerite Oswald. Mr. Ekdahl was, and Fred Korth was their attorney. It would be very easy to get photographs of Lee Harvey Oswald when he was younger and in the Marines and in the State Department and service and so forth, and create these many doubles, which I have outlined, and hopefully we'll get a book out this year, try to complete on the Oswald doubles. It would be very easy with people like the Secretary of Navy having access to this information and knowing Oswald and being able to put these look-alikes in these strategic places, not only to confuse us later, but to also be able to pick up possibly shells or sounds or information at Dealey Plaza and give information to the assassins to assist with their getaway. We still don't know how Billy Lovelady got off the premises without being suspected of being Lee Harvey Oswald at the time. There's an excellent book out about espionage and many of the things I referred to called Spooks. You can order them from Tom Davis at Research. If you have any question about his location now, he has left Nevada and he is living down in Aptos, Capitola. He's moved back to home base and will be sending his books out from there. He has the paperback of Spooks, if you don't have it, or other books on the conspiracies. This book is by a man Hogan, who writes wonderful articles for the New York Times and other. He's a journalist who writes in magazines and has done some fantastic articles. In this book, the chapters, somebody reminded me of these various chapters, and I do have the book on Mitchell Werville, on Howard Hughes, on the Paladins and the weapons, the saboteurs, the Kennedy-Monroe tapes, the use of blackmail for political gossip and holding politicians the way Adolf Hitler did, or Lyndon Johnson, the whorehouse tricker. John Mitchell and Richard Nixon fix them up with the women and then flash the pictures, and you control them forever. This book is about B.R. Fox Company. That's the Philadelphia weapons that connects down to Mitchell Werville in Florida, and Bernie Cornfeld and Bobby Vesco, and many of the things I'm talking about. The murder of Bobby Hall, I've done tapes on, and Howard Hughes and the Vesco connections, and Robert Nahue and his assassination teams, and Intertel, ITT, and Mr. Bain. It's a very, very good book, and all the subjects I mentioned there are covered each in a separate chapter. The biggest problem with many of these books, or continuously of the articles, is that all the information is proper and valuable, but I'm waiting for it to be applied to the particular assassinations in this country. That seems to be the thing that the journalists are not allowed to talk about. Jack Anderson can talk about the ITT and cause trouble for them. He can talk about the FBI and their attack on the Bureau of Indian Affairs, or their COINTEL program. Hogan can write about Mitchell Werville, but he cannot talk about the silencers in Dealey Plaza, even though the House Select Committee Chairman Blakey, who's really a cover-up artist, brings out the fact that there was more than one gunman that killed John Kennedy. The Mitchell Werville silencers cannot be applied to Robert Kennedy, Thane Caesar shooting from behind with a silencer and blaming Sirhan Sirhan, who stood in front of him, or Dealey Plaza, many shells and signs of bullets, more bullets in John Kennedy's body than either the Warren Commission or the House Select Committee would allow us to know. They don't apply the silencers to that. They don't apply the B.R. Fox Company to political assassinations and coups around the world. They have a chapter, The World of Bobby Vesco, but there were articles out a while back, and I have them in my possession, about the possibility that Vesco hired Mr. Youngblood, who shot the fatal headshot of Martin Luther King. James Earl Ray was blamed for that. They said he stood in the Lorraine Motel and put the weapon against the windowsill. There was a shot, and somebody ran away from down below in the crowd where the policemen were. There's a suggestion that Martin Luther King's fatal bullet came from that direction, and articles that Vesco was the middleman who hired the assassin for Martin Luther King. Hogan can write, I guess that's how you pronounce his name, it's Hougan, can write about Bobby Vesco, and you can write about money changing hands and the finagling of stock exchange to millions of dollars, or mob killings, but we are not sophisticated or calm enough to discuss the killings of the inner team of each other, whether it's William Harvey or Sheffield Edwards, or the mob figures, Sam Giancana or Carlos Prios Sequeiros or George DeMohrenschildt or Bobby Hall. We're not able to discuss the police involvement in these killings or the actual agents. There are chapters of them in books, and their expertise at everything except the killing, and it's the killing part that's left out, and yet the bodies are all over the place. Evelyn Knight from the State Department said the State Department is nothing but a bunch of corpses. dead corpses, and she suggested there were bodies all over the place of people murdered. And it was in Time magazine, not in the Village Voice or the LA Free Press. Evelyn Knight of the State Department, and nobody bothers to say, well, tell us who was murdered, why did you say it? She simply says the State Department leads a path of corpses around. So the book on Bobby Hall is good. The chapter on Robert Mayu is valuable. His origins and his link to Richard Nixon and the war against Aristotle Onassis. But Robert Mayu's expertise was the assassination team he set up. And that's the part that's left out of these books. They're not bad books, they're good books. But the part left out are the connecting links of these chapters to the assassinations. The assassination critics of the original Warren Commission hearings became what you call theorists. A theory is only a theory until it's proven to be a fact, but the best minds and researchers refuse to put their energy into the facts linking the killer teams, such as Korkola and Terpil and Cummings, to the assassinations. There's a chapter in that book on Mr. Bain and ITT, and the multinationals, and Aramco, and so forth, and their struggles. Well, there are articles and hints and suggestions of the ITT role in killing Salvador Allende, but it is very rare to pinpoint corporations to the murder of heads of states, and these books only get to the edge of the assassination and do not use their full energy to pinpoint who is doing the killing, and furthermore, how they're getting away with it all the time. There isn't a single book out on the murder of Nelson Rockefeller, or the possibility even that he was murdered. The role of Poinsettia Pierce, Megan Marshak, David Esikoff, the early cremation, the removal of Rockefeller to make ready for the Reagan candidacy. The Rockefeller people keep quiet. The investigative journalists don't seem interested in the subject. So all the information on how silencers are made, or who makes them, or who sells them, isn't as important sometimes as applying it to what is happening all around us. Speaking of assassination weapons, there's a section in the book, The Weapons Merchants, describing Mr. Cummings, the brother-in-law of Senator Tower of Texas. This book describes not only Cummings' background in Philadelphia in the main line, and his father was a stockbroker, drafted in 1945, avoided the shooting war in 1948, went to George Washington University, served as a clerk in the CIA during the Korean War. It goes on to say his first innovation was the purchase of large quantities of surplus light arms in Europe to sell on the American market. Cummings knew that the basis for every fine bolt-action sporting rifle is the German Mauser. He also knew that several European countries were overstocked with Mausers. They were the wrong caliber for NATO standardization and cost money to maintain and store. They even cost money to throw away. Cummings had faith in the United States gun market. There were 50 million American civilians, 24 million registered hunters, and he went on and bought an arsenal full of Mausers, including his arsenal fresh Mausers with Hitler's fingerprints still on them. At the time Lee Harvey Oswald was arrested in the Texas School Book Depository, he was supposed to have had a German Mauser. That was the story that went all over the world. It changed nationality and length and weight and so forth in 24 hours and was an Italian Carcano. But when Lee Harvey Oswald was in the Dallas jail before he was murdered, just 48 hours after the assassination of John Kennedy, he said, well, check out the Mausers in the building. There's German Mausers in the Texas School Book Depository. Well, maybe a man like Billy Lovelady wasn't called as a witness because coming to work at this Texas School Book Depository, he could have possibly planted Mausers in the building or taken away Mausers later that contributed to some of the confusion at the time of the assassination, and maybe were shot from that building to make it look like Lee Harvey Oswald shot from that building. There was a Mauser taken from there, but Oswald knew there were other Mausers there. It's interesting that Mr. Cummings was preoccupied with Mausers and seemed to bring them to the United States and thought they had some purpose. This arms agent, this Cummings, is, as I say, linked to the Secret Service, to the men such as George Korkola, who have, in quotes, extensive legitimate work for the federal government, for the FBI, for the Secret Service, for Federal Aviation Administration. I asked last week on that quotation, what did they have to do with Dorothy Hunt's plane crash at the time of Watergate, or did they have something to do with it? But it really staggers the imagination to believe that men that are part of a team that is arming for the Central Intelligence Agency, the Middle East, earlier it was Batista's team, but all over Pakistan and Europe, South America, and Central America, these people are selling weapons to what are called the Third World, and I mentioned this before, that are really funded by the Central Intelligence Agency, but they are linked to a assassination team that trains assassins, and at the same time it trains assassins with silencers and various gadgets to commit murder. They do work for the federal government, the Secret Service, the FBI, and so forth. It's no contradiction in protection and assassination. If you think of the killing of Robert Kennedy at the Ambassador Hotel, he was shot by Thane Caesar. Caesar was brought in as a security guard from Lockheed and was moonlighting as a security guard for Robert Kennedy when that second gun went off 1 inch from the back of his head, and Sirhan was blamed and charged with that murder. Sirhan, incidentally, was complaining last week. He had a hearing and he wants to get paroled, and he was complaining that his teeth are hurting. He said, "I'm fine, except my teeth are driving me crazy." Lawrence Kwong, who was under mind control and went to KGO and shot there and then walked out and shot himself. He killed one man and then killed himself. Complained about his teeth, and this Dennis Sweeney that killed Al Lowenstein was complaining about his teeth. And various persons have said that the CIA has done experimentations or put electrodes or little radio machines inside the dental work of the mouth. It seems that many of these programmed assassins who have this blank stare, who can't remember why they did it or what they did it for, no particular political motive, do have a dental problem and pain in their teeth. I don't know if that goes along with being a patsy or not. Oswald didn't live long enough for us to figure this out. But there is this common complaint that their teeth are hurting, and there has been a lot of experimentation about concealing certain kinds of controls in the teeth. I'm going to be doing more on the tapes after I cover the election stories. I'm going back to George DeMohrenschildt, the background of George DeMohrenschildt, his relationship to Lee and Marina Oswald and the intelligence community of the United States and the Defense Department. I received my copies of the House Select Committee on Assassinations a few months ago, but they are not indexed yet. Sylvia Marr, I understand, is indexing them, and she did the Warren Commission hearings. I hope she doesn't do the similar job that she did before. She left out the important names, the important neo-Nazi, fascist, actual German Nazis, fascist names she excluded from her bibliography, and that's another story that I have mentioned to you on these cassettes. She is indexing the House Select Committee hearings, and I was very surprised to learn that from Jan Diaz in Los Angeles that the book I Am a Patsy, that DeMohrenschildt wrote about Lee Harvey Oswald was in these volumes. That they said, look, they didn't call him as a witness, but they would print what he was saying. Because I spent years cross-filing the Warren Commission hearings and breaking down the adjectives of Lee Harvey Oswald, the good, talented, accomplished person before the assassination, and then the ne'er-do-well, jealous, angry, hostile one that came out from the lips of the very witnesses after John Kennedy was killed. When he was in the service, there were no mishaps. He could learn his Marine manual and memorize it. He could go to electronics school. He could work in the Philippines with the U-2 flights, or in Japan, and he could master the Russian language and get to the Soviet Union and work in a radio factory, and then come back to this country and bring a Russian wife and father 2 children. He wasn't in debt. He was met at New York Harbor by Spaz Rakin of the International Rescue Committee. He had red carpet treatment wherever he went, and people helped him out wherever he went. And he was quite accomplished, wrote intelligent letters and so forth. And then the other version of him as being a jealous, stupid person who wanted to kill both General Walker and John Kennedy, who beat his wife, who couldn't hold a job. The Wanderer was created by the staff of the Warren Commission, and I broke down the adjectives, both the good and the bad, the documentations of his skills and accomplishments, and then the adjectives to describe the sleazy Oswald that the Warren Commission wanted. And one of the interesting parts of Volume 12, the Warren investigation, not the investigation of the Warren Commission, but the House Select Committee on Assassinations, republished this, it's really just an essay of DeMohrenschildt. And DeMohrenschildt explains that he really liked Lee Harvey Oswald and that he did the wrong thing when he said that Lee Harvey Oswald was the kind of person the Warren Commission wrote up. He said they coerced him to say it, that you're overawed by the people, that Albert Jenner forced the testimony on him, and that none of it was true, and that he apologized to Lee Harvey Oswald in the grave for the disservice he had done and for the lies he had told. And before DeMohrenschildt was murdered, he wrote a manuscript on deaths of other witnesses and how people who told the truth were killed, and I guess he knew he was going to die. But he wanted the record straight, and it's a sad story, and it's a story of his being under the control of Allen Dulles and Albert Jenner. Albert Jenner is the attorney for Henry Crown, who has controlling interest in General Dynamics in the Dallas-Fort Worth area. It made the F-111s and made approximately, I think I once had on a tape, $300 million profit from the Vietnam War, and the war escalated the day after John Kennedy was assassinated. Jenner was the attorney who questioned DeMohrenschildt, and he badgered him, he threatened him, and it's quite sad to hear him describe what happened before the commission. And then he would take the evening off and have dinner with Jacqueline Onassis's mother, Jacqueline Kennedy's mother, and he tells how disgusted he was that the Auchinclosses with the Kennedy family wouldn't investigate who killed John Kennedy, and the burden was on private citizens, that they wouldn't have anything to do with it. I've often wondered about Mrs. Kennedy, Jackie Onassis, and her family. He said that they were Republicans, they voted for Nixon, they didn't like John Kennedy, and so that they had feelings against him as the husband of Jacqueline, even at the time that they were husband and wife. DeMohrenschildt described his life in Dallas briefly with Lee Harvey Oswald and Marina Oswald, and then he went on to say, well, how could I be involved in the assassination? People tried to link me with the assassination, and they were so cruel that I moved to Haiti in April or May of 1963, that I saw the Oswalds one evening. We brought June present at Easter time and we left. So how could we have any part of the assassination? Volume 12 of the House Select Hearings has on page 56 a description of George DeMohrenschildt in Washington, D.C., how he went to New York and Philadelphia and Washington, D.C. in May of 1963 prior to the assassination, and after John Kennedy was killed, he had made another trip to Washington, D.C. and Philadelphia. But he was in the spring of 1963, he was in the Department of Defense in Washington, D.C., and he was talking to the Army Chief of Staff of Intelligence, Dorothy Matlock. Dorothy Matlock testified in September of 1978 that she was Assistant Director of the House Intelligence of the Army until she retired in 1974. She was in charge of human source collection of intelligence and a liaison capacity with the CIA from the Pentagon, and that she was present with interviews of George DeMohrenschildt in April prior to the killing of John Kennedy. Volume 12 of the hearings refers to Mrs. Matlock, M-A-T-L-A-C-K, testifying about meetings of George DeMohrenschildt with a Tony Zakowski of the CIA from Georgetown University, and they were discussing Haiti and Papa Doc. And George DeMohrenschildt left Lee and Marina Oswald, the little Tsarist princess and their friend from the Soviet Union that he liked so much, and they go down to Haiti, but they go to the Defense Department first to meet the liaison with the Central Intelligence Agency. Then a Washington Post article came out September 1964 after Kennedy was killed, and just the month that the Warren Commission was being printed, And it's the story of fighter planes that were supplied for Papa Doc from Dallas, Texas, and how the planes were flown to Haiti illegally, and that boats and weapons were going down to Papa Doc in Haiti. And there were Dallas arms suppliers through Irving Davidson from Washington, D.C., a lobbyist for Haiti in May of 1953. Now, I did a tape or several tapes on Irv Davidson. He's been indicted with Carlos Marcello of the Abscam scandal of working with immigration and trying to get special favors to keep Marcello in this country. Robert Kennedy had him deported for a while, and he worked with the CIA and came back to this country. So that Davidson not only worked with Carlos Marcello's and Clint Murchison and the hub of the wheel of the assassination teams with Jimmy Hoffa and the Defense Department, but he worked with the CIA, and he was down at Haiti with George DeMohrenschildt after DeMohrenschildt left Lee Harvey Oswald and Marina, and just prior to the assassination. The role of DeMohrenschildt wasn't to fire a gun in Dealey Plaza. The role of DeMohrenschildt for the intelligence community was to introduce Lee and Marina to people who would create the personality of Lee that was fictitious that the Warren Commission would use. We don't have time to go into this now, and I'll do more on other tapes with you, but maybe the next few weeks we'll go into the personality of the candidates running for office, dissect them for whatever it's worth, the good and bad, and there's plenty of the bad in all of them. In the meantime, this is Mae Brussell in Carmel, California. You take care, and I'll be back with you next week.